Platform viewers, you are in for a real treat this evening. I have a special guest here with me tonight, Mr. Ace Robinson, and you all are really going to enjoy this presentation and this discussion. So, I'm bringing you the best. We're bringing you a professional to come and talk about medical mistrust and distrust, past and present, and really just in the background and the current landscape of what's happening with the pandemic and chronic disease and the people of color, how it's affecting the communities of people of color. So this is a highly relevant topic. So I certainly don't want to delay any further and just jump right in. And as usual, platform viewers, if you have any questions or comments, please chat them in. We want to hear from you. We want you to learn from this and be encouraged. And so Mr. Ace Robinson, just to give you a background of who our guest is this evening, is a leading administrative and policy HIV advocate and population health expert. He serves communities disproportionately impacted by HIV, COVID-19, and associated illnesses. Robinson acts as the chair of the Federal AIDS Policy Partnership, serves on the board for the Economic and Policy Impact Center, focus on leadership development for BIPOC. He serves as the chair on the Brown University Advisory Council to eliminate anti-Black racism and sits on the UCLA Center for HIV Identification, Prevention, and Treatment Steering Committee. Ace has served in senior leadership roles at the National Minority AIDS Council in Washington, D.C., Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City, Lifelong AIDS Alliance in Seattle, and the Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation in Cape Town, South Africa. Robinson holds a master's degree in healthcare leadership from Brown University, a master's degree in public health from the University of Cape Town, and a bachelor's in chemistry from Duke University. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Ace Robinson, as he has given me permission to address him as Ace. So welcome to the platform. We want to hear from you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for making time for this timely discussion and inviting me to share some thoughts. So again, my name is Ace, and I know that this is a really important discussion we're having. We're not, it's not about me speaking out to the world, but it's about having that conversation. Because if we're not having a conversation, we're not really getting to where we need to be in trying to reduce the impact of things like COVID-19, HIV, and other illnesses in our communities. Because as we've seen, just like in every other, with every other modality, when America gets a cold, Black people get pneumonia. And we have seen this continually be pervasive in our lives. And so what we want to do, we want to have that whole conversation about what we're going to do to actually change that. We can talk about where we come from, how certain situations have occurred that has allowed for us to have reduced or lower health outcomes, and then talk about what are we going to do to change that, because the future isn't written. It is up to us to really change that conversation, change what's being done, and realize a better world for those and for ourselves and for those that we love. So we're going to have a little bit of there'll be a PowerPoint, but one of the things that I really want to encourage is for individuals to put their questions in the chat box. And Natalie said that she'll be able to speak out and stop me at the appropriate time so we can have a real back and forth conversation throughout. So if you don't mind pulling up the PowerPoint real fast.
Sure. Okay.
So while the PowerPoint is coming up, we're going to talk about how we're going to be able to survive and overcome medical mistrust. And so I want to be clear as to what does medical mistrust mean. So you know, like when you mistrust anything, like when you are talking to your friends and they tell you something and you're like, don't give me that mess. Like, this is like what you're saying doesn't really count. It's like due to my past experiences with you, I don't really trust what you have to say. You remember who that person is in your personal life, in your professional life, and even systemically, what's happening in our world. Like, so this goes beyond just the medical side. Like when we talk about what's happening in social justice issues. So we're watching the George Floyd murder trial in front of us. Yesterday, we saw what happened to Dante Wright, and what the immediate response was: the lack of trust in the police and the criminal justice system, and having communities get together and say this isn't right. And so, like, we don't necessarily have all the information, but we know that because of the history, we don't trust what's happening. We look at Karen Navarro in Virginia, what was happening with that Army lieutenant who was scared out of his mind, just being pulled over and still being compliant to all of the actions, and like saying, okay, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but I'm still getting bad service. Now, this is not just within the criminal justice field. This is a very similar conversation that we're having in the medical field. Let's go on to the next slide. Let's a little bit of background about me, so it's like you get a sense of where I am and what I'm all about. My name's Ace, as I said, and so my background is actually in virology. So, like, I didn't come into public health thinking I was going to be having these types of conversations in my adult life. I actually thought I was going to be a basic scientist with the goggles on and the lab coat and the whole spiel, right? And so,
Uh-huh.
like I'm a nerd through and through. I just have had some people teach me how to dress better. So like when I was really focused on HIV vaccine design, that was really what my thing was. So like I knew that HIV, and I experienced HIV in my personal life, knowing that people living with HIV needed to have more options than just the medication for treatment. We needed to make sure that we could prevent it, and that was where I started my career, really focused on science, and then as we see, like, how it didn't just start with this previous presidential administration. It's been going on for a long time, that access to public health, healthcare access, and best clinical practices all come down to really, like, what's happening on the government side. So that's where I kind of went into health policy and really pushing that through. And like, I always wanted to state, like, so like I wanted to make sure that our communities understand that healthcare is not. This isn't a political conversation. This isn't about like a red state versus blue state. This is about making sure that each individual person gets the type of care they need to live their best life with minimal pushback because of things like a preventable disease similar to coronavirus or COVID-19. And we're going to have that conversation. We're going to discuss health inequity, not health equity. We're going to discuss health inequity, how certain individuals are not given the same opportunities as others. So next slide, we'll talk a little bit about like where we've been and where we're going, right? So there's some things that whether you are interested in public health or not, you don't have to go like me and go to graduate school and study public health to know a lot of what's happening in our world. So when we talk about medical mistrust is not something that is this came out of the blue. It's not a strange phenomenon. Medical mistrust came specifically to our communities because our community wanted to survive. That was really what it was about. How are we going to survive as a people when so many atrocities have happened to us in so many different ways? What does it mean if I'm going to be slightly wary of what you have to say? We can talk about what happened in the Middle Passage. Who were those doctors on the Middle Passage? They were individuals who treated the Africans who were sold into slavery as cattle, or so like it's just like, oh well, if we're going to get a return on investment, then we have to make sure these individuals stay alive. And so like they did their little experience of studying, like, oh, okay, well, if we can get this many people into the bottom of the ship, ship them across the world, and then like give them minimal medical care, but then they'll be healthy enough to be sold. And then when they get to the U.S., then we start having like those atrocious types of studies that were being done by we want to call them scientists or doctors, but these are really just depraved people who just wanted to experiment on individuals that they didn't believe that had souls or had real bodies, and saying like, okay, like maybe we can check to see like what happens if we have a live surgery on a human being, and like, or like checking to see is like, okay, well, if we're fitting people for casts, will they heal faster? All these types of things were just all being made so that like individuals could carry out more cotton picking or agricultural work or at the service of other people. Then, like, this isn't really just talking about what happened 400 years ago. So many people talk about the United States Public Health Services study of untreated syphilis on the Negro male. Now, many people also refer to that as the Tuskegee study, but I always want to divest that language because the like Tuskegee University is a great historically black college, and now university, and the Tuskegee Institute. They do some really amazing work, and so people always like when you say Tuskegee, there's a lot that term should be a glorious term. That term means like pride. It means Booker T. Washington. It means individuals who are the best and brightest doing some amazing work. Now, what happened also in that city or in that town was that the U.S. Public Health, I think CDC, like back in the day, came and they started looking at what happens with people who have syphilis, but they're not treated. So they actually they weren't experimented on. It was actually the polar opposite. They were not treated. They were untreated, meaning that even though they learned very early on in the 19 by early 1930s that penicillin could actually treat syphilis, they allowed these men to go untreated for decades, which could lead to blindness, it could lead to paralysis, it could lead to early death. And so like there was available treatment that was not given to these individuals. And then on top of it, you always hear about Henrietta Lacks. I think there was a movie or something. I think Oprah did a movie about Henrietta Lacks. But things that the most important thing is that this individual had the type of cells that didn't, or cells meaning like their blood, like when if you drew her blood and then you look at it under a microscope, her cells like were high functioning, right? And they had the ability to function in a way that might mitigate cancer. It might mitigate other diseases like muscular sclerosis. Like, this individual was being told that they were coming in just for random blood draws and da da da, but they were actually being experimented on without their knowledge. And so these are the types of things that people hear. Like, you might not know the story. Like, let's talk to people in the street about what happened with the untreated syphilis study. When you start hearing people like say, oh, they experimented on them with different types of medication, or like we start having lots of confusion about what actually occurred. Then it's like, okay, well, we need to get our history, but it doesn't matter if you're going to get an A+ in history class. What you know is that Black people and other people of color, whether they were Black, we also hear the syphilis study was also conducted with people from Guatemala. So like you hear that people from various BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, have been mistreated by the medical field, and then maybe have either not gotten care or gotten the type of care that isn't right because they're being experimented on, and that's what leads to medical mistrust. You're like saying, don't trust those doctors, don't trust those clinicians, which has really come down to the fact that like, oh well, we're now in a state where even if there is something that's available to us, we might not be the first in line, which is really what we're going to have that whole conversation around COVID-19 and how something like COVID-19 really is preying on the fact that Black people, due to previous experiences, aren't the people who are first in line for any level of treatment. Next slide, please. Great. Thank you. So that goes back to that whole piece of like when people say you're damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. So let's talk about withholding treatment. You don't have to know the Serena Williams story or to know what happens with women after they give birth. Like the maternal child death disparity between Black women and white women is huge. you literally will when they do those surveys of doctors who are like in medical school or soon to be doctors in medical schools, or even ones who have been serving for 30 to 40 years, believe that Black people have higher pain tolerances, believe that Black people have thicker skin. So then oh, they don't need when white people are being overprescribed opioids and Black people are being underprescribed opioids, both lead to early death, but like with Black people, of course, being sooner.
Mm.
Cardiac care, same thing. So oh well, you hear about someone having open heart surgery or something to that effect, but then not getting angioplasty where they just put the essentially a balloon inside your arteries and bust out your plaque and open up your arteries. So you always see the data shows, even if you control for the type of the amount of cardiac failure, the level of cardiac care that is needed, that white people will get a different type of care than Black people. Whether or not your doctor's Black or white, we see that across the board. And this whole idea that, oh, well, I need to have something more extensive because when those Black people go home, they're not going to follow the doctor's orders. They're not going to eat more vegetables, eat less red meat. It's just like, okay, we need to do something that is going to circumvent that and be and have more extensive care. And so we're withholding the type of care that is considered to be optimal. Syphilis study, we talked about withholding care. HIV care is what I do for a living. When you look at, oh, someone is diagnosed with HIV, and then we see what happens when a white person is diagnosed with HIV. They're given a prescription almost immediately, while the Black people are told to make sure they get home and prepare emotionally for it, and they might get care later.
Mm.
We start talking about coronavirus and COVID, what's happened with COVID-19. It's I can share my own personal story. So I've lost 3 family members and 6 personal
Mm.
last year. So
Oh
I've
my
lost 9
gosh.
friends to coronavirus. And I think you remember what was happening at the very beginning when we first didn't know about it, that oh, because Black people have higher pain tolerances, or maybe they're not being as truthful about what's happening with their body. You see what's happening. Like my cousin, 29 years old, was saying that she was in pain, saying she couldn't breathe. They said, you'll be fine. They sent her home, and she died 9 hours later. um,
Mm.
these are those types of stories. Ellie and I were speaking right beforehand about the clinician where she videotaped herself, talking about how she wasn't getting the care she needed. She said that she was in pain, couldn't breathe. They didn't believe her, and she this is a clinician who worked. She was in the hospital. She was hospitalized in the same hospital that she worked in. And start videotaping the fact that she wasn't getting the care she needed, and of course, eventually, she was able to get what she needed. They ran the exams, and they said, "Oh my goodness, you really are probably in a lot of pain right now. We need to give you the best type of treatment that's available." But at that point, it was too late. And then on that other side, you're damned if you do. It's what are those experimentation? Oh, women who needed support with appendicitis, potential appendicitis, or any gynecological abnormalities that would also be involuntarily sterilized. These things happen, and these things didn't happen in the times of our great grandparents. These things happened 20, 30 years. Deep brain stimulation. You remember those electrotherapy that, of course, we don't do anymore, especially
Mhm.
we don't shock people's brains and hope that they do better. But think about where or how many people were subjected to that early on in their life. And then earlier today, we were talking about environmental justice. Oh well, we're going to have some radioactive treatment plant in this neighborhood, and due to redlining, of course, that's going to be a neighborhood that's predominantly BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And then we're seeing oh, what's happening to kids who are growing up in close vicinity to these radioactive plants. We're seeing what's happening to kids who are subject to lead exposure. It's not just Flint, Michigan, where we talk about lead exposure. We're talking about many parts of the U.S. where lead is in the water, and what we have to do is figure out a way to support people and make sure that we're not only have changed these systems, because we've done a lot of work to change these systems, but making sure that even though these systems have existed, that now that we have better systems, that people are desiring to have the best available treatment to them. Otherwise, we're going to have that same level of disparate care.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry. I wanted to just interject for anyone that's just joining us. Joining the platform, we're almost midway through, and we have our expert here on public health, Mr. Ace Robinson, who's lending his wealth of knowledge and experience to lay the foundation and talk about the history of medical mistrust and distrust, and of course, take us from the past to the present. So if you are joining us, we ask that you continue to chat in your comments or your questions. We want to hear from you. And so I'm going to give it back over to our presenter, Mr. Ace.
Thank you. Yes, please put your comments in the chat box, because again, this isn't didactic. This is about a conversation. Now, when we start talking about like, oh, we want this, we want that, there's a great book written called Medical Apartheid, and for those of you who, like I think you've probably seen Nelson Mandela sitting behind me, for those of you who remember the South African apartheid, saying like, okay, we're going to separate individuals and give them different levels of access to different things in the world, whether it's food, whether it's housing, so on and so forth. But medical apartheid, meaning like, oh, we have two different levels of healthcare and healthcare access in the United States. Because, as people say, America has the best healthcare in the world. That's mainly due to the fact that healthcare in this country is rationed, meaning that some people have access to absolutely everything. And if you have access to absolutely everything, there's obviously someone who has access to nearly nothing. So when you're looking at just within the United States, like where if you are a Black person in the United States or a Latinx person in the United States, and you just go out of your home, like the chances are there's 25% of Black and Latinx individuals who have nearly zero clinicians who are within a 10-mile radius to them, saying like, oh, if you get sick, how far is it for you to get to a primary care physician? How far is it for you to get to a cardiologist, a pulmonologist? How far is it for you to get to the ER? And literally a quarter of individuals have very few clinicians nearby, as opposed to for white and Asian communities, about 10%. So more than double the percentage of Blacks and Latinx people do not have access to care. That's going to play out each and every day in the work that we're doing. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you go ahead a slide? Sorry, I didn't notice.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry. So yeah. So like this is why this is such an important conversation, because like when we're discussing medical apartheid, I can't say like, oh, go get a screening for COVID. Okay. Oh, well, go get your vaccine. Or if you get sick, go to the doctor. So like, if that's a whole extra effort for you just to even get to the doctor, then we're talking about that whole systemic stuff. Like, oh, I'm ready for better care. I know I need better care, but I'm not getting it because, well, there's just no better care available to me. Next slide, please. So now, when we start having these conversations, so I think you very much remember this when we were talking about, we have Dr. Debbie Birx there and Tony Fauci, and then the former vice president of the United States, who we still can't figure out exactly what level of expert, like he was running the COVID task force. When we start having these conversations, and we knew just from those beginning parts of the conversation that we'll go into in a little bit, talking about which communities were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Like this was something that a year ago, like over a year ago, when COVID-19 was first being identified in the US, my very first conversation was like, this is going to be about our communities. But the problem is that the people in our communities were not on TV talking about it. Do you remember, like in March last year, how many Black people thought that they could not acquire COVID-19, that somehow only white people could get it? And it wasn't until Idris Elba, the actor, and Kevin Durant, the basketball player, we're talking about that they were living with COVID-19, that we actually had people who were like, oh yeah, okay, I need to really pay attention to this. This might be about our communities. And this is where that thing about the messenger really mattered, because like I work in the HIV field. I have known Tony Fauci and Debbie Birx for years, but Tony will tell you like he is not the best spokesperson as an 80-year-old white man to be speaking to younger Black and Latinx people or women or whatever about HIV, viral hepatitis, and now COVID-19. He knew full well that his level of expertise is vital, but his level of expertise was not going to be the end all be all for us getting the voices out. And we're going to discuss a little bit later like what that actually could look like. But before we do that, we need to have a bit of a conversation of why our communities are so greatly impacted. Next slide. So COVID-19, so respiratory virus. So respiratory virus, right? Meaning that the way that is passed on between individuals is through the air, through droplets, like your spit goes into the air, someone else breathes it in, and then it can do its thing, right? So why have we seen it in some communities? We talk about in public health land, we call it social determinants of health. Outside of public health land, we really just say social determinants of racism, social determinants of sexism, ableism, queerphobia, all the social ills. Because we start looking at, when we start going into a little bit of the data, you're going to see like which communities were greatly impacted. And I'm going to tell you right now, those communities that were greatly impacted were the ones that had poor healthcare quality. Those that had people were living on top of each other. Like if you are living 8 people in a 2-bedroom home, and then you learn about social distancing. There is no social distancing for your world. And then like the community context. Okay, well, if you have to go to work, there is no working from home. How many people from our community were still working in hospitality? We're doing things like running public transit, people driving the buses or whatnot. Folks who were, when the restaurants were open, running in the restaurants, and they didn't have a whole cash cow of opportunity to I can just not work for a while. Like we had to have those stimulus checks for like $1,000 to $1,400, and it's like, okay, well, is that going to support you and your family as opposed to going to work at all? And then it's just like, okay, so you have to go back and forth to work on these buses. You're going to be crammed. Then you're going to get to like a construction site, or you're going to get to a restaurant, and then you have to do this work. And then you're going to come back home to like this one little environment where you're going to have all these people living on top of each other. So even if your kids are home and they were able to be socially distant, you are not. And then let's say that your parents are living with you. And we saw what was happening with older adults, with our elder sexuals, our elders who were acquiring COVID-19 and unfortunately succumbing at a higher rate. Because the one thing that we saw over and over again, and this is really important to remember, that before COVID-19 was fully known in the United States, they had these whole conversation about underlying health conditions. When we were looking at what happened in Italy, when we looked at what happened in West Africa, when we looked at what happened in China, the people who were succumbing to COVID-19 were primarily people who had respiratory illnesses, cardiac issues, cancer, and so on and so forth. Well, then we get to the US, and people are living with COVID across the board. But so we'll go to the next slide. But people are living with COVID across the board. But what was happening in those communities was very different. So look at this. So when you look at just like the of cases of COVID in our communities, the percentage of cases in our communities were like, okay, well that gray bar you see there is the percentage of those individuals of the U.S. And that red bar was the percentage of cases. And like as we see there, like what we were saying, the Hispanic and Latinx community, and the American Indian, Alaska Native communities were overrepresented by far. Like those were the communities that were overrepresented. Like there are 30% of people with a COVID diagnosis in the United States were Hispanic Latinx. But less than about 17%, while making up 17% of the country. And blacks were about right on. Asians were underrepresented, and whites were highly upper-represented. It goes back to that when white America has a cold, the rest of America has pneumonia. So when we start looking at like what is the interplay? Like everyone has more or less is acquiring COVID-19. That's the reality of it. But then let's start mixing in that conversation. Let's start having a conversation about your healthcare access. Next slide, please. When we start talking about COVID access, next slide. Oh, great, thanks. So when you start talking about COVID access, we're looking really at the percentage of people who are testing positive if they get screened. What does that mean? Is COVID in your community? Right? Like what is the chances that you living in your community are going to acquire COVID and then test positive upon coming in? And that also means that you were in a location where it was easy for you to access testing. And then we start talking about the built environment. What does access testing mean? If you have a 9 to 5 job and you work by the hour, were you able to go get screened at the vaccine spot that was only open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.? The answer is no. The percentage of Black and Latinx individuals who had their initial COVID screen upon hospitalization was in the 60 to 70 percentile. 60 to 70%, meaning that you did not have access to screening at a time that worked for you in order for you to live your life. And then what we know is it's all about with any sort of treatment, whether we're talking about cancer, HIV, asthma. What do we know that the earlier that you find out that you are living with a certain modality, a certain disease or illness, the faster you get treated, the better your health outcomes. And then when you have better health outcomes, especially with communicable diseases, it's sort of like, just like HIV and STIs, if you treat somebody, then it becomes impossible for you to pass that on to somebody else. If you don't treat somebody, then it's going to be very easy for you to pass it on to somebody else. So you have all these individuals who, like, at one point, COVID was probably equal in communities, but the certain communities of people living on top of each other, when it comes to treatment and then bringing it back into your communities, it was much harder in the Black and Latinx communities, like, as you see right in front of you. Next slide, please. So now, when we're looking at what we're saying with, like, when it comes to, if you look closely, I hope this is large enough on your screen. And right now we're looking at deaths, right? So like that red bar right there is the percentage of deaths and compared to the percentage of people in this country. And so when you're looking at the part below is age standardized, which is much more important, like when we start looking at like what was the real disparate impact. So if you're a non-Hispanic white person, if you're a white person in the U.S., there's a much less likely chance that you were going to die of COVID from COVID-19, as opposed to Hispanic, which you see is highly overrepresented, and Blacks are overrepresented in deaths compared to the number of people. So remember what I was saying when I was saying, like, in certain countries, it all came down to underlying conditions. We know you don't have to spend much time in Georgia or Texas that like white people are just as overweight, are living with the same levels of diabetes, have the same levels of asthma, all those things, right? But why is it that in this country, your race and ethnicity, or AKA your association with racism, was so strong? Because of all those other factors. Like, how easy was it for you to get to a doctor? How easy was it for you to get treatment? And then if you were getting treatment, was it the optimal treatment, or was it the easiest thing for the doctors to do, just to send you back home to fend for yourself? All these things came to play, and to COVID specifically within the US. And other countries that are really grappling with racism as a public health crisis are seeing very similar levels of disparate care. Whether we're talking about South Africa, whether we're talking about Brazil, any the countries that have that where race are like, and also like Israel and like what's happening with the Palestinians, where you're saying like there's when the tale of two cities, if you have this identity, this is your experience and you're going to live if in the event that you acquire COVID. But if you have this identity, you're not, because the world is not set up for you to have that better life. So next slide, but please, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat box and we'll discuss, because this is a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But we're going to go into the meat of what we can do in the future to change how this is not going to be our future going forward.
Absolutely.
Now, Like I'm looking like as just really gave a snapshot of the District of Columbia, because this is where we're talking about what are our solutions, right? So this is current as of a week ago. As of a week ago, in the District of Columbia, which is like the second to the bottom, the one that's highlighted in blue. Now, if you want to go over to the orange column, that's your percentage of deaths. 70% of people in DC who have died from COVID-19, 70% are Black African American individuals. Even though Chocolate City is no longer chocolate, you see in that light blue bar on your right that less than 50% of DC is Black African American. Now it's now at 46%. But then scroll back over, let your eyes scroll back over to that green column. That's your percentage of people who have acquired the vaccine, who have started their vaccines. Now remember, this is where we talk about the facts about the vaccine. Whether you got Pfizer, whether you got Moderna, whether you have the Johnson and Johnson vaccine, it doesn't matter which one of the vaccines you got. There have been 0 people who have died of COVID-19 related causes, or even from side effects from those 1 days after you get a vaccine. Some people get like chills or get a fever for a day. But the point is, we know 100% of people who get the COVID-19 vaccine live. 100%. But we're like, whether it comes down to like some people talk about vaccine hesitancy based on medical mistrust. Some people talk about access, healthcare access, like why is there a medical apartheid and who can get treatment. And then we can also talk about like if you are getting treatment, are you getting the same level of treatment? So you put all those pieces together. It's like nothing's just all on its own. All of that stuff put together is back to those social determinants of health. Like, are you able to get a vaccine? Do you know the vaccine is going to work for you? And then if the vaccine is available, is it set in a time that works like in the way that you need to live your life? Is it available at 9 p.m. when you're actually home and available? Is it available on the weekends when you're trying to do everything from getting groceries to cleaning the house to helping take care of family members and all that? And is there only like a 4 to 5 hour window for you to get that vaccine? And the one thing that we always push back to that piece of like making sure we get the message out to our community. Like, I'm a public health person. This is what I do. It's like I talk about this stuff all the time and like so on and so forth, but I'm just one person. And so I can say whatever I want, but who do I need to get to? We need to get to the person who's sitting there watching the TV or talking to their best friend who is saying like, oh, COVID-19 is either not real or the vaccines aren't tried and tested, which we can speak about in detail about how tested any vaccine is. But those things are very important to make sure we build the trust, to make sure that orange column doesn't remain as it is. That doesn't have to be that way going into the future. Because if we're 46% of the DC population, we should also be 46% or less of the percentage of death. That means that they were doing the work that we need to do to make sure that any poor health outcomes matches our percentage of the population. Because we see there that the percentage of cases is about the percentage of the population. No one gets to be more likely to acquire it because it's a respiratory illness. It's fair and equitable. But when we're saying like, okay, well, what happens if you are a person who acquired COVID-19 but you had a vaccination? You're not going to be a person who dies. You're going to be a person who has a cold for a week and a half and then go about your business while you're quarantining, making sure that you don't pass it on to other people. These are very important conversations, and why it's so important to make sure that we know that the community is behind this, the community supports it, and this is how we're going to get to where we need to be. Next slide, please. So, like, when we look at who are the people who have been behind all this work, like a lot of people have, like Tony has become famous due to political stuff, but Tony's a great guy. But when you look at Dr. Kizzy Corbett next to Tony in that picture, the woman with the long hair, someone who has been a researcher developing developing like how we're going to develop vaccines to prevent COVID-19. She's been doing SARS work. Remember, like COVID-19 is a SARS virus. She's been studying SARS viruses since she was in graduate school. I think she was at UNC in North Carolina, but now she's at the NIH, who are doing this great work. And like we really want to make sure that they are getting the information, saying like, oh, well, if Kizzy Corbett is great, and Dr. Suber you see at the top, who has been one of the leading clinical researchers and developing the type of care that we need, looking at antibodies, like how are we going to do the antibody care? How, like, you know, the special type of care that they said was only for Donald Trump when President Trump almost died from COVID-19 during his presidency. It was all like, oh, well, what type of treatment was he getting? It was like from the work of people like Dr. Suber, and like the preventions from the work of people like Dr. Corbett, saying like our community has been involved in the development and the implementation of everything related to COVID from the very beginning. This is like these individuals didn't start working on respiratory illnesses afterwards. These were already the superstars who were changing the game, changing how we were doing this care, and how we were able to develop a vaccine relatively quickly, because we did this on the backbone of all the work of so many of these researchers who have been working on SARS viruses for years and for decades. It's not like HIV. When we learned about HIV in 1981, there was no work on retroviruses. That was all new, But in this case, with SARS viruses, we have decades of work that will help us look at how are we going to apply all of that research and put it into a pipeline to make sure that a safe and effective vaccine is fully available to individuals as soon as possible. Because I think there's one thing that, like, I always hate to assume when I talk to individuals, it's never quite known, that with clinical care, with anything related to clinical care and clinical design for a vaccine or things that go through the FDA, number one, the FDA is an independent body. It's an independent body. It doesn't matter who the politician is, whether it's President Biden or President Trump. They never had to answer to those individuals. And the first thing that happens is, like, this really comes from the HIV field, is that you do, like, you know, like when you're developing something new, a new treatment, this is very important, like to make sure that everyone understands this. When you're developing a new treatment, everything goes into into a queue. Everyone stands in line and waits for the FDA to look at look at everything else that came before, because there's new treatments and new vaccines and new things like that being developed all the time. But what's really important is that when there is a public health emergency, that instead of waiting in line, you get to go first. So the FDA is reviewing something and saying, okay, no, you need to go back to the drawing board, or this isn't right, or that isn't right. And we saw that happen with like the Johnson & Johnson one, just to make sure that it was safe, because we had to stop it just to make sure, okay, AstraZeneca, no, let's stop it, make sure that it's safe, all those things. And then as soon as you're ready to be reviewed again, boom, you're being reviewed. And this is how things ended up going more quickly with the COVID-19 vaccine than other vaccines and other treatments, because they were always at the front of the line, because this was such an important topic and such an important healthcare crisis for all of us. So next slide. So now, like, when we're having these conversations, and I think this is really important, like, I can go on and on and on for hours about why vaccines work, why it's important for our communities. Like, we can go back to any of this data I'll share with the platform to make sure that everyone has this. Just because when you're talking to friends, like, some friends are going to respond to data. Some people are going to respond to your personal story. Like, why was it so telling that, like, you know, like you saw so many Black people, especially Black healthcare providers, who were putting on Instagram, Facebook, wherever, like, showing that they got their COVID-19 vaccine, saying like, I did this. I took my parents to do this. For people who are lucky enough to have their grandparents, I took my grandparents to do this, and making sure that people know that this is not like a public health conversation. Like, when I talk about the 9 people in my life who have died from COVID-19 in the last year, 8 of them were Black. And it's just like, I would do absolutely anything I could to take a vaccine, go back in time, and find a way to get them to take the vaccine if they were even hesitant at all. Because the one thing I have to do is make sure that I'm listening to people and listening to like, oh, what is your challenges? Your challenge, you just can't get there. You can't get there during a time that works for you. Is your challenge that you think that that these vaccines don't work, that they came out too fast, and that you might need some more information on how clinical trials work, because like that whole thing about the word guinea pig, like the people who put themselves up there when we didn't have enough information, those people existed. Those were called study participants. Those study participants have been doing this around the world for a long time. Like, you know, not forever, since we've been aware of COVID-19 and we started doing vaccine development, but like there's no one who is being a guinea pig. And so like those people who are first in line are not first in line. They come after, like, you know, tens of thousands of individuals who have already started this whole process. And when we're having those conversations, the first and foremost thing is we do not shame people. I'm not going to shame people into getting a COVID-19 vaccine. I'm going to listen and empathize and make sure I'm sharing the correct facts, because it's so important that we come from a place of humility, honesty, and truth to say that we're going to get to where we need to be for our community. Because if we're going to be a better and a stronger community, we have to have all the facts. We need to be able to talk to each other in a way that's filled with love and support, and not with shame and blame. Shame and blame, as we know in the land of HIV, only makes things worse. But love and support is how we're going to get to where we need to go. So when you go to dcvaccines.org and look at, or any of the other vaccine spots, like the CDC has a whole entire website. I'll have to share that later. We'll share that with the attendees later on to see like where you can get your vaccine. Know, number one, that there are people who look like you and me who have been working on this well before we even knew what COVID-19 was. We developed something that works, and where 0%, no longer 70% of our community, being the community in the DC area and other communities that's exactly the same, being overrepresenting the deaths. If like to eliminate those deaths, where we can dream and we can hope for a better world, where COVID-19 was a story that we talk about, how we survived from 2019 to hopefully by the end of 2021, and then we moved on with our lives. But if we don't do these pieces, and this is the part that's really scary, because this is what happened in HIV, that if we don't do what we need to do for our own communities, soon it's going to be other communities that are doing better and that are healthier, and it's going to be just us again. We're going to be the ones who are still acquiring COVID. We're going to be the only ones who are getting sicker. We're going to be the only ones who are still dying from it if we don't do that work.
Wow.
So the next slide, I just want to share contact information. And do feel free to reach out to me via Twitter. I think we know Twitter is taking over our world. So feel free to direct message me if you have any questions. You can email me if you have any questions. But then we really want to make sure that we're making time for, like, you know, this isn't me. I'm like, you know, I'm no longer a basic researcher. I might study this stuff and understand it, but the end all be all is that we're uplifting the other work of individuals who have given up their entire lives to create treatments and vaccines and other levels of prevention to save lives and make this a more equitable experience on this planet for all of us. So I think we can stop sharing slides now. I think I saw a couple of things pop up in the chat.
Yes, you did. And so give me just a second. Let me bring this down, this slide. And okay, and it's just us. And thank you again. That was very powerful. It was detailed. It was a high level overview of where we started and where we have to go, and of course where we are presently. And there was a question about vaccine access or callbacks from these mass vaccination clinics, or going through the state channels to get the vaccine. And so the question the viewer had is like, I have friends that live in DC who don't have access to vaccination. They're signing up on the websites but are not being contacted.
So this is the part that I think is where we talk about the systemic part of the conversation. Because if you don't have the access to the internet and the time to keep refreshing on your screen to make sure you can get signed up for the vaccine, you might go behind other individuals. So one thing that is, I think, very important to know, on the 19th, in a week from today, a week from like next Monday, everyone in the U.S. will have access to vaccines, regardless of their status. And there's mass vaccination efforts occurring at the arena where the Mystics play. I always forget the name of it. What you might want to help me there. They're having vaccination where the Mystics play. There
Uh-huh.
also mass vaccinations in downtown DC occurring, in Maryland. I'll have to send this out to you because I don't want to misspeak, but like there's 3 or 4 mass vaccination efforts in the greater DC area where people
Mm-hmm.
just show up and get it done. Like the DC is still vaccinating individuals in grocery stores, and the one thing is,
Mm-hmm.
from DC Health, is you cannot throw those things away. So if
That's
people
right.
for their appointments, you get your vaccination. I didn't have to wait for my my healthcare providing status to get me a vaccine. I just walked into the grocery store and I said, "Oh, you got some left?" She's like, "Oh, I got 7. We're about to close." I was all like, "Well, you're gonna have 6 because I'm getting my vaccine right now." So it's just like, and when we talk about making sure that we go into the grocery stores, because like I went into a different grocery store, I saw the line around the place, and they didn't have, like, everyone's busy, they didn't have time to speak to individuals about it. And like, I was just standing there and I forgot what I was wearing, but someone identified me as someone who worked in healthcare. And then
Mm-hmm.
ended up having, for people who weren't standing in line, I would start answering a lot of questions about the vaccine, because there's a lot of fear. Because if you don't do this stuff for a living, there's going to
Mm-hmm.
there's often a lot of fear. And so, like, when you saw like the callbacks, this is very similar to any sort of healthcare thing, that we make sure before it gets to the community, they run test after test after test to make sure that there is going to that number one, that it's working, and number two, that if it, like, that it's not hurting anyone. And when they see any little sign that this might actually hurt somebody, they shut it down and get it gone. So, like, it's just like a bad batch. So it's not like um, yeah, I like, I always compare healthcare to Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is great. They've done a great job getting people to really want their product, even if they've never tasted it in their life. I don't care where you go to on this planet, people know about Coca-Cola, whether they've had it or not, or even seen a can or not. So,
Uh-huh.
so like before they get it to them, they make sure that Coca-Cola is going to taste right. It's going to taste just like the can that you got 3 months ago. It's going to taste just like the can that you're going to get 2 months from now. And they make sure that it's all the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not, and if it's not the same, they pull that batch and get you a new one, and you never know the wiser, because there's so much detailed attention about the vaccines. Even though the community never would have even come close to touching that batch of vaccines, we knew that there was like, oh, it got pulled back, being like, and it's sort of like the story is the 99.9% of times everything went right. No one's going to give a report about that, because that's not going to get you a couple more views on NBCnews.com or CBSNews.com,
Mm-hmm.
wherever you get your information. But we want to make sure that there are a lot of checks and balances in place to keep you safe. Not just
Mm-hmm.
like during the research period. Now that we're past the research period, there are people who are working around the clock to make sure that absolutely every vaccine that is going to our communities is safe and effective. Every single one, not most of them, every single one. If there's a chance that it's not, they will shut down that entire. We call them a batch. So if you ever notice that, let's talk about like a batch would be like you're in a grocery store and there's something wrong with the yogurt. You know how they find out, like, oh, you can look on the bottom of the yogurt and there's like a little number that says what batch it is. That's kind of the same thing, to being like, oh, there's something wrong with this. Take them all out. Make sure they never get near people. Like, because
Mm-hmm.
it won't like put you in the hospital, because we don't want anyone to get sick, or even worse, get a vaccine that's not doing anything. Because I mean, what's the point of getting a vaccine that's that either got too warm, You know how you have to keep them cold, and be like, oh, this whole batch got too warm while it was in transit. We need to throw them all away. Like those are important things to know, as opposed to having people go through that and then getting a phone call like 2 weeks later saying, oh, by the way, your batch was warm and you pretty much just got a shot of water, you didn't really get anything. So all of those pieces have to be working, and we really want to make sure that, like I said, every single vaccine shot that is given is helping you.
Absolutely. And I think, Ace, what I thought was there's so many things about your presentation this evening that was powerful. And I really liked that you showed, oh my goodness, is a doctor. It was two women, and I can't, now they're not in front of me. I can't remember their names.
Yes.
Um, Yes, but I think what was so important about that is that they are women that we can identify with. They share some of the same skin tones or hues of some of our viewers. That you can see that there are those who look like you, and a part of your community that are part of this. They were a part of the research and continuously a part of the research and the
Mhm.
development that brought these vaccinations to life, that brought the medical information forth. That these, so it's not, there's this myth that all of the work, the science, the research is all being white controlled. We have no part in it. We're at the end of the line, where all the information, all the tests, and everything is rolling out on us. And so that's a misperception that we have not had our hands in the pot, so to speak, in the development, in the research, and the science that's going on. And so I appreciate you showing that picture that these are people that are real, that are in this, fighting on a different front. And as a healthcare provider, I can also speak to what Ace is saying. There are things that we're doing to ensure the quality of the vaccine, temperature monitoring. We're constantly documenting. We're in constant contact with DC Department of Health, where there's a whole system built around accountability and shipment and tracking. And we had to show as a clinic that we can have the correct environment that's up to industry standards to monitor the temperature of the vaccines and be able to store them properly so that anyone that's getting the vaccine in their arm, knowing that they're getting a quality, viable product and not something that's no longer viable and it's not going to help you. And so that's even what we're doing here on the front lines. But there's so many, many individuals, there's so many agencies that have gone before it even got out to the clinics, before it even got to our hands, that's done their due diligence to make sure that you're getting getting quality and getting the best. And I remind patients that yes, with any vaccination, with any medication, with anything that you're taking, there's always a risk for side effects. There's always a rare occurrence or a rare event that may be an allergic reaction. But what we do know is over 500,000 people have lost their lives from COVID-19, and we can't say that about the vaccine. And so, yes, your arm may be sore. Yes, you may feel a little tired afterwards. But we're here. The vaccine is present and it's available to you, free of charge, to slow down this pandemic and save lives. And that's what it's about. And any final thoughts, Ace, that you would like to share? Where do we go from here? I know you shared some of that in your presentation, but any final concluding thoughts?
Um, the most important, this is always the most important part of the conversation, um, that when we talk about or how we're going to support each other and love on each other, um, that means that we're going to have to come from, I think I said before, from that space of humility, and just listening, because you don't know, even as somebody in your own family, you don't know the road they walked to get to make a decision about not getting a vaccine. You don't want to punish them by saying, "Well, you're not going to see grandma until you get it." It's not. That's not about the conversation. We're about trying to make sure that each person is going to be whole and loved in the decisions that they're making, and then we have to be cognizant that some of us will make some different decisions, and we need to be okay with that. but I'm really excited as to where we're going, and that because we're going in the right direction. We are like the Black community is starting to pick up more when it comes to vaccinations. We're starting to have the right speakers coming to our communities. It's like, like I can redirect people to Dr. Oni Blackstock and her sister Irvi, who's been on. I think they're on CNN every other day. Why it's important to have someone like Greg Millett, some like we're trying to make sure that, or Francisco Ruiz for the Hispanic Latinx community, or Chris Paisano for the American Indian Alaska Native community. You have to have individuals who come from our communities, who know our struggles and know our experience as to why we don't have access to care, why we might be hesitant if we do have access, and then working through that. So this is one big conversation about we're going to change the game based on love, respect, healing, and care, and that's how we're going to get there together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I can't thank you enough for sacrificing your time, bringing your wealth of knowledge and experience and your training to the platform for our viewers, to bring our viewers the best information out there, the latest information, the most current information, and backed up by fact and data, and by the quality of the presenter and their knowledge that they're bringing. And so, without hesitation, Mr. Robinson, when I reached out to him, he agreed to do this. And so I so appreciate him for doing it. And I just want to encourage all of our viewers, for the lack of knowledge, how people perish. And that's why we're taking this moment to bring this information to you. Think about it, pray on it, get online, research it, go to reputable website, cdc.gov. Without hesitation, please reach out to Ace Robinson. He has provided his contact information. I have flashed it up on the screen so that you can look. If you have any questions, you can also reach out to the platform at prayertowerchurch.org. You can email us, and if I don't have the answer, I'll make sure I'll get it for you and get back to you. And so, again, I cannot thank you enough. Mr. Robinson, God bless you, and be encouraged. And I'm so sorry to hear what happened to your family members and that their lives have been lost. But I'm grateful that you are channeling your grief and your pain to educate others, to inspire them to make different choices. Now that we have the vaccine available, that you all would choose it and save a life. And so, again, I'll be with you, the platform, every Monday at 7:30. We'll be back next week. Until we meet again, be blessed to be a blessing. Have a good evening.